Have you ever wondered how the Abrahamic religions search for and justify truth through different things such as causality or miracles? Hi, my name is Kimberly, and today we're interviewing three religious scholars to find out how they manifest Middle Age Islamic debates through their religions. Christianity and Islam are the largest religions in the world right now. So how do they relate, and what are the rudimentary parallels that they have between them?
Between Islam and Christianity, I think one parallel is they both are committed to the idea that there's one God who created the world when there was nothing. So there's God, there's nothing, and then this God created the world.
That bridge between something that is eternal and omniscient and, infinite, and all the adjectives that are given to God in Christianity are very similar. There's this gulf between a finite human being and the infinite, eternal creator. And then it comes with the notion of being made in God's image, so that this utter gulf between man and God is sort of bridged in some ways. There are all these kinds of notions, and I think they're probably in Islam too, of Christ within.
God is not a creator that is uninterested in the world. This God takes an interest in the world and takes an interest in human beings specifically. So this God specifically selects particular human beings to represent this God on earth and communicate his messages to the various human communities that are out there. Another very deep similarity between Christianity and Islam is that they're both confessional religions, in the sense that they both feel like they have universal truths and a set of associated practices that all human beings should subscribe to, ideally speaking.
It's the idea of a single truth, that you can't have, there has to be one true religion. So I think that's where the sibling rivalry comes in, that only one thing can be true.
So, there's a reason why Islam and Christianity are some of the world's largest, they're the two world's largest religions, because they feel like they have the truth and they want to share that truth with other people, and that people can join their community quite easily.
So aside from specific ideological concerns, these Abrahamic faiths have very many philosophical underpinnings that are similar to one another.
The thing is, they both have to grapple with Greek philosophy.
Aristotle, and as I say, and Plato are the basis of the three Abrahamic religions. So you have to really go back. And Averroes and Avicenna were, everybody played around with Aristotle. And Aristotle gets totally connected with Catholicism.
So they both have to grapple with this very, very attractive and persuasive system that in some ways agreed with their central theological convictions, but in some ways disagreed with their central theological convictions.
And Judaism, though the smallest of the three Abrahamic faiths, is the ancient source of both Islam and Christianity.
Fundamentally, they grew up in the same neighborhood, around, the same kind of philosophy and way of thinking, and so I would say very similar, both in terms of the language as well as the content and approach, even though I'm sure there's plenty of differences too.
I think that one of the differences between Islam and Christianity, Islam and Judaism, is that Judaism is not much of a missionary religion. It is a religion that is a little bit more tied to a particular cultural group.
Even if you didn't believe in God, you're still Jewish, because it has all these other ethnic people qualities to it, that you're part of the people, whether your faith, you have the faith or not. Whereas sort of like you can't be a Christian without believing in Jesus, right? I mean, that's like a fundamental thing. And I think maybe, in Islam too, if you don't believe in the Prophet, right, and Allah, then you're kind of like, well, you're not really part of the people, part of that group.
Conversely, one thing that Islam and Judaism have in common together, in contradistinction to Christianity, is that the law and ritual and a legalistic understanding of ethics is something that is very, very important.
One defining difference is the whole concept of the Messiah. I mean, that's a real fundamental, and we all, it's interesting, we all have Messiah concepts, right, in these three traditions, but we imagine them differently, and I think in some ways that's the biggest gap.
In the search for truth, the role of reason was and still is up for much debate.
The debate on exactly what are the relative roles of reason and revelation in determining truth. This is a huge debate within Islam, and Ghazali has in my opinion, a fairly sophisticated take, and he thinks that many of the most important theological convictions cannot be arrived at through reason alone, or cannot be arrived at in a decisive way with certainty through reason.
Take someone like St. Thomas Aquinas. I think there was a very strong tradition of Christianity being reasonable, all right, that anybody who was rational would understand Christianity and convert to it. So Aquinas writes his Summa Theologica, which is, volumes, but everything is answered. Okay, so reason, I think, and it's an interesting use of reason, but I think it's different from Al-Ghazali there, because he did take that mystical step.
There were those theologians and religious scholars that thought reason is fallible. Reason is a human instrument. Reason is prone to being diverted by the human passions, by selfishness, by greed. Human beings have a huge propensity to rationalize and justify what they want to believe and what they want to do.
Jewish laws are divided into different categories. So like there's things that you say, yeah, oh yeah, well, we would come to, any rational person could come to that idea on their own. You don't really need God to tell you not to murder, right? That, we could sort of say we'd figure that out by ourselves. But I don't think anybody would have come up with the idea on their own not to eat pig or not to mix milk and meat. So we have these other sets of laws that are kind of faith-based, but they're kind of mysterious. Like they're not really logical or reasonable.
You have those people that thought, well, actually, reason can determine central theological ideas. In fact, you need reason to discover those truths, because if reason is not able to discover those truths, then you will not be able to arrive at the truth of Scripture, at the truth of revelation.
Aside from reason, the performance of miracles by saints and prophets in Abrahamic religions has played a significant role in the determination of truth also.
I think the question of miracles is absolutely clear throughout Judaism, Islam, and Christianity.
A miracle is something spectacular that happens, that represents a break in what conventionally occurs.
From time to time, strange things happen, and you have no idea, like you can't really explain them. How did that happen? I don't know. It's a mystery.
It was called occasionalism, and so there was this idea that God is all-powerful, and if this happened and this happened, God had to put them together. So he pulls the strings in everything, and it reduces human agency.
So, yeah, I think there is kind of maybe a debate. There are those who feel that, and again, this probably goes along sort of from the more orthodox traditional to maybe the more progressive side, that, more traditional people feel that God is more intimately involved in the providence of everything that happens to you, and probably as you move more to the far left, it's like maybe God's not so involved at all if you believe in God, and then I think somewhere in the middle, that God sort of, I tend to think about it as sort of the divine flow is kind of like a river, and that we can so that there's definitely a force that's moving us along, and that we can try to read that force and move with it, and if we try to go against it, we can end up upending our canoe.
The breakage in what conventionally occurs is supposed to be explained by the fact that there is an omnipotent God that is using the breakage to support prophets or to support saints in their virtuous mission. I think Moses is a huge miracle maker, or many miracles happen by his in his prophethood. We don't expect a stick to turn into a snake. We don't expect a hen to start glowing spontaneously, and we don't expect an entire sea to part to allow safe passage to a particular group of people.
But no, so part of miracles, I think, are about this idea of human and divine partnership, that we're working together, and so God can't do it alone, and we can't really do it alone. And there's a great story about, I think he's Moses' nephew, and his name is Nachshon ben Aminadav. And when they get to the shore of the Red Sea, and they want to cross over, and Moses is calling out to God, saying, "Help! They're coming to get us, and we can't get across." And in the story, God says, "Hold out your staff, and the water will open." But in the story that the rabbis tell, this guy Nachshon kind of just jumps into the water, and he starts walking across the water, and the water's getting higher and higher, and it finally gets up to his mouth, and he cries out, "Who is like you, O God?" It's from the Torah, Mi chamocha, and at that moment the waters cross. The idea being that it really took the initiative of an individual to kind of be ready to jump in to make miracles happen.
But if you want to emphasize God's powers, I guess Ghazali wanted to do, you emphasize that he is coming. Malebranche does this in European, he was a 17th century philosopher, so there was a big debate.
Though miracles are significant in Abrahamic faiths, there still is skepticism that arises about them.
If you talk about prophetic miracles, most of the religious scholars, I think maybe with the exception of a small minority of modernists, are going to say, yeah, miracles happen. Prophets did miracles. So what? We don't care if it doesn't comport with scientific understanding, right? That the vast majority of the Muslim scholars and theologians are going to accept. There's going to be a lot more debate about are there miracles that happen to people after prophets? Because Muhammad was the last prophet. There's not going to be any prophet after him.
So miracles then began to be questions, and that's why I spent a lot of my academic life studying witchcraft as part of the scientific revolution, because it became smaller and smaller and smaller what witches could actually do, until eventually people gave up on them. So Protestants, it starts, and they sort of begin to believe miracles stopped in 400. All right, because they're seeing that it's harder and harder to have miracles.
The rabbis who kind of really shaped Judaism struggled with that issue, and they could not really abide the idea that there could be a break in God's habit or the break in the natural order. So the way that the rabbis understood it was these things were built into the universe from the beginning. So okay, the Red Sea is going to split when the Israelites are crossing. All right, well that was like a special thing, like in video games, there are like these special fixes and tricks you can do. So these are things, Bilam and the talking donkey. Those were, miracles, but God put those in the universe already, ready to go when needed. So that was how the rabbis kind of understood them.
The important point is that the miracles function to establish the credibility and authority of the person at whose hands the miracles happen.
Though experiences such as miracles are an important facet for religious truth, there still is the religious texts and their interpretation that leads to formal argumentation.
The Quran points to these signs, often in poetic ways, and urges human beings to reflect on the signs and to come to the right conclusions. As Muslim thinkers started developing formal, coherent philosophies and theologies, they started developing these ideas and putting them into a much more systematic, formal way of arguing and demonstration.
In Christianity, there were two great books that you read. You had Scripture and you had the Book of Nature, all right, because God made nature and it was good. So by the time you're getting towards the scientific revolution, there's this notion, and someone like Robert Boyle, who's the father of chemistry, says we scientists, they were called natural philosophers then, but we are the true priests because we are reading the book of nature. Okay, so experience it would certainly be from the book of nature, and then you'd have revelation.
There are also going to be those people, and Ghazali kind of gives you this in some instances, that think that true faith and love of God is not produced through formal demonstration and through philosophical reasoning. That true faith and love of God is something that occurs through causes, accidents, experiences that add up and create that faith in you.
I mean, I'd say this is more of an issue of faith, but I think the faith comes from experience more than anything, and an emotional response. I mean, that's sort of my take on it, I guess, and less on the can we, somehow prove the existence of God in some way.
The best religious scholars try to integrate all of these aspects of human experience, and they base their religious philosophies and their approach to religion without neglecting one or the other.
So we've talked about experiences and reason as two independent things, but where these two intersect is the manifestation of role models in the three Abrahamic religions.
What it means to live a godly life is found in Muhammad in its most perfect form, but is also found closer to our own times in individuals that achieve, greatness.
You are a sort of lowly spider and you're on this thread. He's got the big scissors, and if you don't obey, you're going to be dead. How did we get from that very Calvinist notion of original sin and predestination to prosperity churches today, where Jesus is your friend? Jesus was not your friend back in the 16th century. Or back in Byzantine times. He was the patokranter, he was krator, he was the judge. He was not your pal. How did we get there? Because we live in modern society, and all the changes that have happened explain. I mean, if you go through and you look at the way Jesus is portrayed through the centuries, or the Virgin, it's fascinating. So historical change has always been there.
Muhammad, at least in Sunni Islam, makes mistakes, and he's corrected by God. And Muhammad, when you read his biography and you read his sayings, is very much a person that's involved in a community. He has fights with his wives. He has conflicts with people. He gets upset with them, but he also shows them mercy and compassion. So he's very much this individual that is firmly rooted in social life and in the earth.
One of my favorite stories is a Hasidic story from about a rabbi named Zusia, and he was on his deathbed, and he was crying, and all of his students are gathered around and said, Rabbi Zusia, are you worried that when you die, God's going to ask you, why were you not as great as Moses? He says, no, I'm not worried about that. He said, Rabbi Zusia, are you worried that God's going to ask you, why were you not, as great as Solomon, as wise as Solomon? He said, no, I'm not worried about that. He said, well, what are you worried about? He said, I'm worried that God's going to ask me, why were you not as great as Zusia? Right? The idea is that we're only measured against our own potential.
Through the discussion of role models, we can see there are many similarities in the ideals of Abrahamic faiths, despite their inherent differences. However, the social and cultural differences between these religious groups often overshadow the similarities and brings animosity and a lack of tolerance.
Identities that are involved and opposed to each other in these conflicts, and then those groups that are a party to that conflict interpret their religions in order to solidify the boundaries between them and in order to engage in conflict.
One of the horrible things that happened in medieval Christianity was the notion that, as I said, taken from Aquinas and other people, that if you were reasonable, you would believe in Christianity. And therefore, this led to increased anti-Semitism. Judaism always was a problem for Christians, because if Jesus was a Jew, if Mary was a Jew, if the apostles were Jews, why didn't all convert? And so there was that terrible problem.
If you have a context in which there is a severe conflict over land, over money, over control, over power, and it just so happens that the parties to that conflict are organized around religious identity, then they're going to find within their religions those ideas and those resources to justify that conflict.
They have so much in common that you would think they would get along, but they don't.